And I'm delighted to be here today with Faith and Law to discuss some of the key ideas that I think have shaped American educational policy. Now, I want to say you heard about my background, and although I have degrees from Yale and Princeton, I wasn't really all that well trained in philosophy. So what I'm going to share with you today about what I understand to be some of the key debates in educational philosophy and practice came out of my own curiosity, my own need as a professor to understand what was going on in the institutions where I taught and in the lives of the students that I wanted to mentor. So when I moved from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill to Yale University, where I went, I was an undergrad there and I went back on the faculty. I actually lived in a student dorm for those 3 years. And I lived in Calhoun College, which was the dorm that ended up getting renamed. But it was through my time in Calhoun and through discussion groups and reading groups that I was having with students that I started to feel that something wasn't quite right. And when all of the protests over racial issues broke out, what was underlying a lot of those issues is fundamentally, what is the mission of the university? What does it mean to be educated? And what are we supposed to do with our education in the world? Well, one thing that I did, and that's what I want to share with you today, is I took a step back. And as a professor, trained in sociology and psychology, by the way, not in philosophy, someone who deeply cares about the impact of education on the world. That's why I got an education. I wanted to bring these ideas that I studied in sociology and psychology to bring them to bear on questions of justice and questions of fairness, questions of economic growth and freedom. I cared about all that, but I changed paths a little bit, and I'm glad I did, because now more than ever, I understand the importance of my vocation as a teacher. And I understand better what it means to integrate knowledge with action in the world, but also with the moral development of myself as a teacher and of my students. Now, in the time we have today, I can't summarize for you everything I've learned about philosophy of education since I started really studying it about 7 years ago. So what I'm going to do is focus on two key figures who you may never have heard of, but who were in debate with each other about educational philosophy. One is John Dewey. The other is Jacques Maritain. When I first began to think about educational philosophy, I was fortunate to meet Hank Edmondson, who's written extensively on both Dewey and Maritain. And I read, at Hank's suggestion, a phenomenal book, a short book by Jacques Maritain. It's called Education at the Crossroads. Now, who was Jacques Maritain? He was a Frenchman. He was a convert to Catholicism from atheism, and he had studied philosophy at the Sorbonne. He came to the United States in the mid-1940s after authoring many books on philosophy, but he came here fleeing Nazi persecution because his wife was born Jewish in the Soviet Union and had fled Soviet communism, eventually converted to Catholicism, became a poet and a philosopher like her husband, but was being persecuted for her Jewish origins, and they fled to the United States. So this short, accessible book that he wrote, Education at the Crossroads, was actually a series of lectures he gave in the mid to late 1940s, just as we were coming out of World War II. And the primary person that Maritain is responding to in that book is John Dewey. Now, you may not have heard of John Dewey either, but he was an extraordinarily influential philosopher in the late 1800s and early 1900s who cared deeply about making philosophy practical in the world. And he has, perhaps more than any other philosopher, influenced the way Americans think about education. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about some of the debate between John Dewey and Jacques Maritain. And I hope that what you hear today inspires you to read not only some of their key works and think about it for yourself, but read some of the other authors and ideas that I'll talk about more towards the end. But let me start with the fundamental debate between them. That's the first thing. John Dewey really cared about methods of education. He wanted to push back against a kind of education where children sit in rows and memorize facts. He really wanted to set up the classroom as an experiential environment where people do things, and it's through doing things that we learn about the world. Jacques Maritain says in Education at the Crossroads, there's a lot to be admired in the kinds of methods that grew out of a Deweyan experiential approach to education. However, Maritain, speaking as a philosopher to Dewey as another philosopher, says the problem is that Dewey has forgotten to talk about the end of education. What do we do with all these methods? And Maritain is very clear that the end of education is to form the human person in freedom. And he specifies what his view of human nature is and his view of the human person. Now, Dewey doesn't do this. Dewey never says explicitly what his understanding of human nature or the human person is. It's implied through his philosophy, as I'll explain to you. But Maritain starts off by saying he's speaking broadly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, speaking as a convert to Catholicism, speaking out of the Thomist tradition in the Catholic Church, influenced by personalism, another school of philosophy in France at the time. And he talks about the human person being endowed with reason. Endowed, we're given this gift of reason, and with a supreme dignity in how we use that intellect. So we have a dignity tied to how we use our intellect. And man is created in freedom to be in relationship with God, and our supreme righteousness, our goodness, our end as human beings, is to know and obey the law of God. And he also holds on and explicitly says that human beings are also sinful and wounded and in need of redemption. This perhaps is the biggest contrast with Dewey's implicit philosophy of the person. Dewey was really influenced by a kind of pragmatism that was really optimistic about human nature. If we could just get our methods right and get our classrooms right, we wouldn't have to worry about things like sin and discipline in school. Maritain's a bit more measured. Humans are created for greatness, but we're sinful and fallen. We're wounded. And despite that, we're called to greatness, but we can only get to that greatness through grace. A grace that we pursue in love because love is pursuing us. Okay, so this is the big difference between Maritain and Dewey on human nature, I think, is the nature of our sinfulness, which is largely absent in Dewey's progressive optimism and is balanced in Maritain's understanding of us as called to greatness, but held back by our sinfulness. So, that's a philosophical question. Okay, what does this matter to their views of education? Okay, well, here we go. So for Dewey, now we're getting back to Dewey. I realize I'm going back and forth. I'm trying to play two sides here, be a debate. Okay, so for Dewey, what really matters is the classroom should be focusing on scientific knowledge. For Dewey, all knowledge is an instrument. It's experimental, it's scientific, it's progress, it's forward-looking. Well, for Maritain, science and technology is great, but Maritain also really cares about, what were some of the words we heard earlier today? Wisdom, I think we heard, wisdom and discernment. That was part of the prayer that we offered up here, right? Well, Maritain thinks that alongside scientific knowledge, we need to educate people for wisdom and discernment. And it's not clear to me that Dewey thinks there's something that's wisdom and discernment that's apart from creating things in the world. Maritain thinks moral knowledge of right and wrong and true and false and good and bad, are a category to themselves that can't be reduced to what happens in the world, right? Again, Maritain's coming out of a critique of the Soviet system and the Nazi system, which did a lot of things in the world, but some of them weren't very good. And on what basis do we make that judgment? That's a moral question. Science, in and of itself, does not answer moral questions. can inform them. But Maritain's very clear that science can't answer those moral questions. It's very fuzzy in Dewey, what he thinks about that. For Dewey, another reason people love to read Dewey is he was also trained in psychology, and he wanted to uphold a vision of the person as having a social side. Like, our consciousness needs to be integrated into a social role, right? So he was really big on education, educating people to have a social role, to do something for society. And look, that's wonderful. Maritain says that's great. Yes, everybody does have a contribution to make to society. But we have to be very careful to not let what we think is the social role of society, for anybody in particular, to overtake the end of education, which is to actually educate the inner dynamism of the student. We shouldn't be too hasty to put people into social roles through education. We should be educating people with content and knowledge, including knowledge about themselves as free human beings endowed with a human nature by God, and empowering them to discern their own calling and their own vocation, which has a social implication. But a vocation is not a social role. So for Maritain, education has to continuously stoke the inner dynamism of the student, the inner spark of the student. And it's not clear to me, because Dewey is silent on his view of the human person, it's not clear to me that he really has the depth of Maritain's understanding of the soul. Now, I mean, again, it may seem like I'm making a big deal out of nothing, but Dewey talks a lot about forming habits. Maritain talks about forming virtues. There's a difference between habits and virtues. Virtues are habits that are good for you. And what's good for you isn't something you can tell because it's a habit. A habit could be a vice, right? So Maritain doesn't want to form people into people who have habits, because the habits they have could be really bad ones. Maritain's actually really worried about deforming people into the wrong kinds of habits. Similarly, for Dewey, when he talks about education, he's really talking about schools. He really wants to meld schools and society. Schools are supposed to produce things to change society, right? The school, the classroom, the methods that he's talking about. Dewey really deeply cared about democracy, and he thought schools were supposed to transform and undergird and make democracy progress, right? Schools are supposed to have this very political function for Dewey, of political function to uphold democracy. Well, Maritain also believed in democracy, but he wouldn't agree that education is limited to schools. He thinks education happens at home, it happens in churches where you learn dogma, you learn doctrine, you learn practices, and he thinks education, so school, church, family, and being a member of community for Maritain, all of that is part of education, not just schools. So, and again, what ends up happening in Dewey, this is, again, I know I'm going through a lot of ideas quickly here, but for Dewey, part of what's going on with Dewey, he sees teachers as being people who facilitate what goes on in the classroom, right? Teachers set up the classroom, they set up the experiment, and then students experiment, right? That's experiential knowledge. Well, for Maritain, teachers bring knowledge of content and moral knowledge in themselves into the classroom. Teaching for Maritain can't simply be facilitating an experiment or facilitating a dialogue. Teachers have to know their subjects and know content. And they have to know moral questions and have wisdom. You see, part of the big difference, I already mentioned the difference between the two of them, Maritain and Dewey, on the nature of the human person. In particular, Maritain's balancing of our call to greatness with our sinfulness, and Dewey's emphasis on a kind of progressive, naive, I would say, short-sighted understanding of the human person as not being sinful. They also had a different understanding of God. Now, Dewey himself was raised in the Congregationalist tradition, and for most of his life would have called himself a Christian. But he embraced a kind of Christianity where what God was experiential, which again, sounds great. And I want to affirm the partial truth that that is. We know God in the world. I heard Faith and Law. You all are here because God wants to work through us in all aspects of the world. I believe that. But the question is God only present in the world? Or is God also transcendent, unbounded, beyond us? And Maritain would say that God is transcendent as well as immanent. And again, those sound like big words, but I'm telling you that they matter. Because for Dewey, the way we know God's working in the world is God is working in the world. What do you need creeds for about the nature of who God is? We don't need to talk about is God monotheistic or something like that. I mean, we don't need the creed. We don't need to talk about the Trinity. Do we need to talk about the incarnation? God's in the world. So for Dewey, religious creed and frankly, religious cult, the Sunday going to church, that didn't matter. What mattered was doing things in the world. Well, for Maritain, if God is transcendent, then part of our calling as human beings is to contemplate his greatness and his majesty and to worship. For Maritain, religious creeds matter. They might disagree with each other, but for Maritain, we shouldn't stifle the notion of a religious creed or ritual. So for Dewey, this is another really important insight, right? Another important insight about Dewey, a legacy of Dewey that's still with us today. For Dewey, it's extremely important. Theology is not a branch of knowledge for Dewey, and it is for Maritain. For Dewey, there's no right or wrong, there's no true or false about religious creeds or doctrine. Theology is not knowledge. Science is knowledge. Morality is not knowledge for Dewey. Theology is not knowledge. Science, experience is knowledge. That's it. For Maritain, he thinks that theology, building on John Henry Newman, is a branch of knowledge, that we can, with our reason, know the nature of God. That's a bold claim. But Maritain also thinks with our reason we can know the nature of the human being. So did Aristotle, who was not a Christian. Right? Maritain thinks that our reason can reason about things that are unseen, like our human nature, like our soul, like God. It's not clear to me that Dewey thinks we can reason about anything other than science or experience in the world. All of that is impressionistic. Where does that leave us? Maritain wonders. Where does Dewey's version of education lead us when we actually want to talk about problems of poverty or economic development or violence or racism, when we can't have a rational discussion about moral questions or the nature of God or the nature of the human person? Where does that leave us? I'm not clear. Now, okay, so I want to leave a lot of time for discussion on this because I've really only focused up till now on Dewey and Maritain. But to back up, the reason I've done this, the reason I've taken this approach is that I really think that ideas matter for education and for education policy. So what do I think a good education is? Stems from my understanding of some of these big questions we've been talking about. So I'm now going to propose a little bit about what I have learned in my past 7 years or so studying these questions about the connection between educational philosophy. Well, first of all, we need to discuss the content of education. We need to discuss the curriculum, not just methods and not just funding. Hey, look, funding matters. We need funding and we need methods, but we can't reduce discussions about education to funding or methods. We need to talk about the content of the curriculum. So when I say I'm in favor of a liberal arts curriculum, by that I mean in the sort of K to 12 realm, that students should be exposed to the primary ways of knowing the world: mathematics, fine arts, music, history, religion, political philosophy. A lot of schools are not teaching today some of these fields, like history or music. I think we should be teaching poetry in K to 12, because the human being, and this is not to the detriment of math and science or technical forms of knowledge. Please keep in mind, I have not said I don't believe in technical education or technical forms of knowledge. They're a form of knowledge. They're not the only form of knowledge. That's what I said. And so somebody whose future career might be in a technical capacity as a mechanic, as a computer coder, does that person need to study history and English literature and music? I would say yes. So this vision of liberal arts education I'm talking about should not be opposed to a technical profession. Liberal arts education is fundamentally about forming people, as Maritain says, to be free and to know their nature and to be able to use the gift of their mind to pursue their vocation in the world and their relationship with God. That's what a liberal arts education is. Well, there's implications for what the content should be in schooling. Yes, absolutely. Yes, there is. Dewey's pretty silent on that. It's about the methods. It's not about the content for Dewey. In fact, because Dewey doesn't really also believe in tradition, Dewey's very forward-looking, so everything's about progress, everything's about science. No, Maritain thinks that content matters because we need to pass on certain forms of knowledge. Doesn't mean we don't have debates about them or that tradition doesn't change, but Dewey wants to get rid of tradition. No, I think we need tradition in education. A tradition that's open to the future, yes. But the future starts with knowing the past. And specifically, I'm concerned about the loss of teaching of history and literature, poetry, and music at younger ages. Now, I also want to just say that when I give these talks on liberal arts education, I'm also not by any means saying that liberal arts education should be this vision of this kind of curriculum I've laid out should be for the elite, should be for people who are going to lead lives where it doesn't matter how much money they make. No, that's not what I'm saying. Just because somebody's born in an urban area and their parents didn't go to college or they're from a rural part of the United States, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be studying English. Now, maybe they're not going to major in English at college. That's okay. But are we going to deprive people in a free society of this integral vision of education? Why? Why would we do that? I have seen with my own eyes this model of liberal arts education I'm talking about is being applied in the inner city in Newark, where one of the alums from my seminar program, Stephen Adubato, teaches. Yes, inner city young African-American men in Newark like to talk about what it means to be a human and what it means to be free. They like to read philosophy and discuss it. They enjoy it. They also enjoy math and science. But my point is that the liberal arts education that puts these questions about who we are as human beings and who is God, puts that at the center of education, that's a vision of education that can be embraced in urban areas, in public schools. It can be embraced in community colleges. Look, the curriculum I'm talking about is most easily found today in certain elite schools that have maintained a core curriculum. It's most likely to be found in the burgeoning movement of classical education, of which I'm a proponent. It's most likely to be found in homeschoolers who've left the public education system for some reasons. But that doesn't mean that this core curriculum can't and isn't already being applied in community colleges. There's community colleges in Texas and in New York that have adopted a core curriculum. Because the core curriculum I'm talking about can go alongside a form of technical training or a form of certification to be a mechanic or a nurse. Why can't you study to be a mechanic and a nurse and also study a little bit of Aristotle? I don't see why. It's not either or. We have to get past this either or. It's not it. And why do I care about this so much? Because a materialist education produces materialists, and a technocratic instrumental education produces technocrats. I want our scientists and our technicians and our electricians to have moral knowledge and to have spiritual knowledge because it's good for them as human beings. Students of all backgrounds have spiritual needs. And having worked in a variety of different universities, I can tell you their spiritual needs are not being addressed by their education. And what's the result? The burnout that we see. There are students who have brilliant minds and all the opportunities in the world, and they're asking, why am I doing this? Why? And who am I as a person? And what am I called to be? Not just what am I called to do in the world. We're really good at telling elite students, you need to go do this and get this degree and change the world and fix this and all that. Who am I? Who am I fundamentally? Am I really free? Does God really love me? Is there another world? These are questions that a classical liberal arts education would help students think about. And when right now, for example, we're going through a tremendous amount of crises, we need people who know how to do things in the world. I'm in favor of doing things in the world, but we need people who know how to think about problems in the world from a complex understanding that brings in different forms of knowledge and does not neglect the spiritual needs of the human person. Okay, so just to wrap up, this is why I started Scala. I continue to teach at Princeton Theological Seminary. I love it. I teach classes on resilience and suffering. I teach classes on Christianity and liberal arts education. But I started Scala because I want teachers and administrators and policymakers to know the debates that have shaped American educational institutions, because these debates are still with us. We need to fix the curriculum of our schools. And we don't have to think that this is an idealist system. There are exemplary educators out there. There are exemplary model schools that are already doing this. This is not a dream. I believe this movement to bring back classical liberal arts education, to think about theology and morality as fields of knowledge, not subjective opinions. I believe there's broad-based support in the American public for this. I believe these are the values and the vision of education that the founders of this country had. And I believe that Jacques Maritain's warning at the end of World War II is just as valid as today. If America wants to preserve its freedoms and its scientific progress and world leadership, we have got to return to a system of education founded on a robust understanding of the human person as created by God, a unity of mind, body, and soul, who is capable of using their reason, growing in wisdom, and most importantly, growing in love of God, which is the ultimate source of love of our neighbor. Thank you.